It had been years since anyone mentioned the old fairground. Tucked away on the outskirts of town, barely visible through the thick underbrush, it had long since become a forgotten relic. A place where laughter and joy once echoed, now consumed by silence and decay. Most people avoided it. The locals claimed it was cursed, the site of a long unsolved tragedy that lingered like a bad omen. And yet, the allure of its mysteries was undeniable. Maya had always been drawn to places like this, forgotten spaces that whispered secrets of the past. As an urban explorer and part-time writer, she had spent years seeking out these forsaken places, documenting their decaying beauty and the stories that time tried to erase. The fairground, however, was different. It wasn't just another abandoned building or deserted factory. It had a reputation, one that intrigued her more than anything. For weeks, she had been researching it, old newspaper clippings, online forums, interviews with elderly townsfolk. Each story she found was more unsettling than the last. They spoke of a tragic accident that occurred there years ago, when the carousel, a stunning, ornate contraption that had been the pride of the fairground, had malfunctioned during a late-night ride. Several children had disappeared, their bodies never found. The fairground closed shortly after, and people began to whisper of hauntings. The faint sound of music would echo through the trees, even when no one was around. Sometimes, the carousel would appear to move on its own, the ghostly laughter of children filling the air. Maya had heard these stories before, of course, but this time, something felt different. This time, she felt a compulsion to visit. The sun had just begun to dip below the horizon when Maya parked her car at the edge of the fairground's overgrown fence. She grabbed her camera and flashlight, steeling herself for the night ahead. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying wood, and the wind rustled through the trees, making the tall grass sway like something alive. The fairground loomed ahead, its rusted gates half open, as though inviting her in. As she crossed the threshold into the deserted grounds, the first thing that struck her was the silence. There was no sound, no crickets, no birds, just the distant rustle of the wind, and her own footsteps crunching on the gravel. The carousel was the centerpiece of the fairground, its towering structure partially obscured by ivy and vines. The once vibrant colors of the wooden horses had faded to dull pastels, chipped and cracked from years of neglect. The entire structure looked as though it might collapse at any moment, but it still stood defiantly against time. Maya circled the carousel, snapping photos of the broken horses, the shattered mirrors, and the rusted metal poles that once carried the riders in loops of joy. She felt a strange tug in her chest, a gnawing sensation that something was wrong. She didn't know if it was the place itself or the story she had read, but something in the air felt thick, almost suffocating. She set her camera down for a moment, listening to the silence. But then, just as she was about to turn away, she heard it. The faintest sound of music. At first, Maya thought it was the wind rustling through the trees or the distant hum of some mechanical device still lingering in the derelict fairground. But no, it was music, a soft, haunting melody that seemed to come from nowhere. Her heart skipped a beat as she strained her ears, trying to locate the source. The tune was distant, barely audible, but unmistakable. It sounded like an old carnival song, one that had been played 1,000 times before, yet somehow warped with age. The melody sent a shiver down her spine, and she instinctively reached for her camera, snapping another picture of the carousel. The music grew louder, clearer, and for a brief moment, Maya felt a pull toward it, a strange, almost magnetic pull. The carousel appeared to have stopped moving, but the music persisted. The horses, now lifeless and cracked, seemed to watch her. Their painted eyes, though faded and chipped, glinted in the moonlight. She took a step closer, her curiosity pushing her forward despite the creeping unease that tightened around her chest. Her flashlight flickered as she approached the carousel's base, and her breath quickened. The soft, echoing notes filled the air, warping and twisting, as though something was deliberately distorting them. Maya's fingers trembled as she reached out to touch one of the horses, its wood cold and rough against her skin. Just as her fingers made contact, the music suddenly stopped. Maya froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The sudden silence felt deafening, oppressive. She glanced around, her eyes scanning the shadows, but the fairground remained still, unmoving. The air seemed heavier now, as if the place itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. A chill ran through her, and she stepped back, feeling a surge of panic rising within her. What was that? What had she just heard? Suddenly, she heard a sound behind her, footsteps. Light, almost playful, like the scampering of children. Maya whipped around, but the area was empty. There was nothing but the rustling of the wind in the trees. She was alone. She exhaled slowly, trying to calm her racing heart. The stories had gotten to her, that was all. Her mind was playing tricks, creating things that weren't there. She told herself that she was being ridiculous. But despite her attempts to rationalize, a sense of dread settled over her, creeping under her skin. Maya took one last look at the carousel, her camera now abandoned on the ground. The faint music started again, but this time it was louder, clearer, and as she looked toward the carousel, she could have sworn she saw one of the horses twitch. Not in a mechanical way, but as though it had moved under its own power. Without thinking, she turned and ran, her footsteps echoing in the silence behind her. She didn't stop until she reached the gates. As she glanced back, she saw nothing, just the crumbling fairground, the faint glow of the moon on the broken carousel. But the music, it didn't stop. It followed her. Maya's heart raced as she drove away from the fairground, the haunting melody filling her ears until it slowly faded into the night. Maya couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed her, even after she had driven miles away from the fairground. The faint, eerie melody lingered in her mind, like an echo that refused to fade. She tried to convince herself that it was just a product of her imagination, a combination of the stories she had read, the loneliness of the place, and the isolation she had felt in that eerie space. But there was an unnerving weight to it, something deeper than mere nerves. That night, she hardly slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the carousel, the cracked horses, their blank eyes staring at her with unsettling intensity. She could still hear the music in her head, distorted and warped, like the sounds of a carnival that had long been abandoned by time itself. It was as if the carousel had imprinted itself on her mind, its ghostly melody now a permanent soundtrack to her thoughts. The next morning, Maya found herself standing at her kitchen counter, staring at the pile of photos she had taken the night before. The images were haunting, some blurred and darkened by the poor lighting, others clearer but no less unsettling. She picked up the camera to review the images, her fingers trembling as she scrolled through the shots. Then she paused. One photo stood out, an image of the carousel she had taken just before the music had stopped. The frame was perfectly still, the horses lined up in their decayed beauty. But in the lower corner of the image, something strange appeared. A shadow. At first, Maya thought it was just an imperfection on the lens, but as she zoomed in, her breath caught in her throat. There, in the lower right corner of the photo, was a figure. A person. It was faint, barely visible, and yet unmistakable. A small, dark silhouette of a child standing between the horses, their head tilted slightly to the side, as if peering out from the shadows. The figure was blurred, but the outline was distinct enough for Maya to make out. A child. She blinked, trying to make sense of what she was seeing, but the more she looked, the more it felt wrong. The figure wasn't positioned where she had seen anyone standing the night before. There was no one in sight when she took the photo. Her stomach churned as she closed the camera, setting it down with shaking hands. She couldn't ignore it anymore. This was more than just a feeling. There was something at that fairground, something old, something that wasn't supposed to be there. And it wasn't finished with her. Maya knew she had to go back. As the day dragged on, she found herself lost in thought, distracted by the image of the child in the photo, and the persistent feeling that the fairground was calling her back. She had to find out more. There were too many unanswered questions, too many strange things happening for it to be just a figment of her imagination. The stories she'd read about the fairground, the accident, the missing children were just the beginning. She needed to understand what had happened there and what had become of the people, children in particular, who had disappeared. The sun began to set, casting a golden light over the town, and Maya made up her mind. She gathered her equipment, checked the batteries in her flashlight, and grabbed a bottle of water. She would go back, but this time she would take a deeper look into the history of the fairground, the missing children, the accident, and, most importantly, the strange, haunting music that had followed her home. When she arrived at the fairground, the scene was just as she remembered it. The rusty gates, the overgrown paths, and the dilapidated carousel standing as a silent sentinel in the darkening twilight. But something was different this time. The air felt colder, heavier, as if it knew she was coming. She hesitated at the entrance, feeling a wave of dread wash over her. But the pull was too strong. She had to go inside. The moment she stepped onto the grounds, the faintest sound reached her ears, soft, almost imperceptible. The music, it was back. Maya froze, her heart skipping a beat. The melody was distorted, like a broken record, but it was unmistakable. She looked around, expecting to see something, anything that could explain it. But there was nothing, just the empty fairground, the broken carousel, and the shadows that seemed to stretch out further than they should have. She took a deep breath, gathering her courage, and began to walk toward the carousel. As she moved closer, the music grew louder, clearer, filling her head like a persistent hum that wouldn't let go. The horses stood frozen in time, their cracked and faded faces illuminated by the dim glow of her flashlight. Maya reached into her bag and pulled out the old newspaper clippings she had found during her research. The story spoke of an accident, one that had taken place many years ago during the final night of the fair's operation. The carousel had malfunctioned, spinning uncontrollably, and several children had been thrown from their seats. They had disappeared that night, their bodies never found. But the oddest part of the story wasn't the accident. It was the aftermath. People who had been near the fairground in the days and weeks after the incident spoke of hearing strange sounds, laughter, whispers, and music coming from the carousel. The townspeople had tried to shut it down, but it wouldn't stop. The music played on, and then, as suddenly as it had begun, the fairground had been abandoned. The gates were locked, the rides dismantled, and the grounds left to decay. But something about the fairground hadn't been finished. Something had been left behind. Maya couldn't explain it, but she knew it had to be the reason why she had been drawn here. It was the children. They were still here. Somehow, their presence lingered, trapped in the place where they had disappeared. The music grew louder again, and Maya's breath caught in her throat as she turned toward the carousel. The horses seemed to shift in the shadows, their eyes glinting as if alive. And then she saw it, movement. One of the horses, the largest one in the center of the carousel, was slowly turning its head. Her heart raced, and a wave of nausea swept over her. No, this wasn't possible. The carousel was broken. The horses couldn't move. But as she stared, frozen in fear, the horse turned its head further. Slowly, methodically, and then it opened its mouth. A child's voice, faint and crackling, echoed from the horse's open mouth. "Come play with us." Maya's blood ran cold. Maya stumbled backward, her mind racing to comprehend what she had just seen. Her flashlight flickered erratically, casting jagged shadows across the desolate fairground. The child's voice, distant yet unmistakable, still echoed in her ears. "Come play with us." Her heart thudded in her chest as she stood frozen in place, paralyzed by the surreal and terrifying reality unfolding before her. The horse, its cracked, lifeless eyes now strangely bright in the dim light, seemed to sway ever so slightly, its wooden joints creaking with an unnatural rhythm. The voice had come from inside the horse, from the mouth of the figure carved into the body. "Play with us." The words reverberated through her skull, so real, so alive, that she could almost feel the child's presence, as if something or someone was watching her from within the carousel's eerie, broken form. Maya's breath quickened, and she took an instinctive step backward. She had to get out. Now. This was insane. She couldn't stay here any longer. Whatever was happening, whatever had drawn her to this cursed place, she wasn't prepared for it. She turned to leave, but something stopped her, something pulled her back. It was the music, the same haunting, warped melody that had plagued her thoughts for days. It had grown louder again, filling the space around her like the unbearable hum of an unseen force. The sound seemed to bleed into the very air, growing thick and oppressive, wrapping around her like invisible hands that wouldn't let go. She glanced over her shoulder at the carousel. The horses, frozen only moments ago, were now shifting ever so slightly. The small, faintest of movements, almost imperceptible, but undeniably there. The figures that had once been still were now alive, and the nightmarish vision of the child's voice was only the beginning. Her fingers gripped the camera tightly in her hand as she reluctantly turned back toward the carousel. She couldn't leave without answers. There had to be an explanation. Her rational mind screamed for her to leave, to run as fast as she could, but her curiosity was stronger. Play with us. Maya's heartbeat pounded in her ears as she cautiously approached the carousel again. She aimed her camera at the horse, praying that she was just imagining the movement. But as she took the picture, she noticed something she hadn't seen before, a shape, faint but clear, in the background of the photo. A shadowy figure standing at the edge of the ride. It wasn't one of the horses. It was a person, or, at least, it looked like a person. Her blood ran cold. She had taken this photo only seconds ago, yet she could already see it. The figure was there, and it wasn't moving like a normal person would. It was like a blur, just a flicker of light and shadow, too fast, like something that didn't belong. Maya clicked another picture, her hands trembling as she reviewed the image on her camera screen. The figure was closer now, and though it was still obscured, there was no denying the unsettling presence of something or someone out of place. The whispers returned, growing louder this time. Play. Come play. The voice wasn't just from one source now. It surrounded her, an unsettling chorus that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Her throat tightened, and she turned to flee, her body moving before her mind could catch up. She ran, not looking back, her legs carrying her through the fairgrounds' winding paths, away from the carousel and the unbearable feeling that something was watching her every move. She passed the cracked remnants of other carnival attractions, the Ferris wheel, its seats hanging motionless, the remnants of a shooting gallery, all shrouded in shadow. Each one felt like a reminder that this place wasn't just abandoned. It was forgotten, cursed. The fairground had once been a place of joy, of children's laughter, but now it was something darker, something far more sinister. Maya reached the gate, breathing heavily, her body slick with sweat. The world around her felt muffled, like she was caught in some strange bubble, everything muted, stretched out of time. Her hands shook violently as she fumbled with the rusted latch, struggling to free herself from the grip of the place. The latch gave way with a screech, and the gate swung open. But as she stepped outside, she felt an overwhelming sensation that something was wrong. The air around her felt too thick, and the ground beneath her feet seemed off, as if she were walking on a surface that didn't quite belong. She stopped, her breath catching in her throat. The fairground was behind her, but she didn't remember crossing this far to get to the gate. She turned around slowly, her eyes scanning the empty space. The gate. It was closed again. It shouldn't be closed. Her pulse quickened as she approached the gate once more. The latch was still open, yet the gate had somehow shut behind her, as if the fairground were trying to keep her inside. A low hum, like the faint music she had heard earlier, filled the air once again. The whispers were louder now, clearer, and they were all around her. She could feel them in the air, pressing down on her. Come play with us. Her feet carried her back into the fairground before she even realized it. She didn't want to go back. She didn't want to hear the voices. But her legs moved as though controlled by some unseen force, her body pulling her forward, past the rusted rides and the broken attractions. The carousel loomed before her again, the melody swirling in the air like a ribbon of sound that tugged at her very soul. As she approached, the horses stood still, their empty eyes glistening in the dim light. But something had changed. In the center of the carousel, something was different. A small figure stood there. A child. The figure was small, perhaps no older than 5 or 6. Its hair was disheveled, and its clothing, dirty, worn, looked like it belonged to another time. The child stood motionless in the center of the carousel, staring at her with wide, unblinking eyes. Maya felt her chest tighten. This wasn't possible. This couldn't be real. Come play. The voice came again, but it wasn't coming from the carousel. It was coming from a child. The figure took a step forward, its movements jerky and unnatural. Its eyes, dark and hollow, never left her face. Maya's breath came in shallow gasps as she backed away, her legs trembling beneath her. The child smiled. The smile was wide, too wide, stretching unnaturally across its face. The corners of its mouth seemed to peel back, like something that wasn't quite alive. And then the child spoke, its voice low and distorted, as if it had been buried deep underground for years. You're one of us now. The child's smile, too wide, too twisted, seemed to stretch forever. Maya's heart slammed against her ribs as she stared at the small figure, paralyzed by the terror swelling inside her chest. The words echoed in her mind. You one of us now. She wanted to scream. She wanted to run. But her legs refused to obey, like they were tethered to the ground by an invisible force. The carousel loomed behind the child, its cracked horses frozen in place. Yet something about the scene felt wrong, alive in a way that defied reason. The air had thickened, heavy with the weight of something ancient and unnatural. The child's eyes were still locked on her, unblinking, dark and hollow, as if peering straight into her soul. Maya tried to move, tried to break free from the paralysis that had overtaken her, but her body felt as though it were encased in cement. The whispers, the soft, eerie music continued to swirl in the air around her. They seemed to come from all directions now, like they were coming from inside her own mind. The child stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, as though its limbs didn't quite belong to it. The space around Maya seemed to warp as the figure approached, like time itself was folding and stretching in impossible ways. You're one of us now, the child repeated, its voice rasping, barely audible over the haunting music. Its smile widened impossibly, revealing rows of teeth far too sharp, too many for such a small face. The child's skin was pale, almost gray, as if the life had been drained from it long ago. Maya's pulse raced as she took a step back, her mind screaming for her to escape, but her legs refused to move. The child was right there now, standing mere inches from her. The smell of decay, of something long forgotten and left to rot, filled the air. Maya's stomach turned, but her body was frozen, like she was caught in the web of something far larger than herself. And then the child spoke again, but this time its voice was no longer that of a sweet, innocent child. It was wrong, distorted, hollow, like it was being echoed through layers of static and distortion. You're one of us now. The words were warped and broken, seeping into her brain like poison. She could feel them taking root, twisting her thoughts, eroding her very will. Maya gasped, the reality of the situation slamming into her like a wave. She wasn't just trapped in this broken fairground. She was part of it. She had been drawn into something far darker than she could ever have imagined, a place where the lines between life and death, between the living and the dead were blurred beyond recognition. The carousel's music began to swell again, louder now, rising like a storm ready to consume her. The haunting melody seemed to pull at the very fabric of the air around her. Maya's body trembled with fear, but her mind was still reeling. What was this place? What had she stumbled into? She had come here seeking answers, seeking to uncover the truth behind the mysterious disappearance of the fairground and the stories of its haunted past. But she never could have prepared herself for this. The child reached out, its pale hand extending toward Maya. Its touch was cold, like ice, and as the fingers brushed against her skin, a shock of searing pain ran through her, as though something deep inside her was being ripped away. The world around her seemed to warp and twist. The fairground dissolved into a blur of color, sound, and shadow. The carousel spun faster, its horses now moving, their cracked eyes gleaming with a strange, otherworldly light. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if the voices of the lost souls trapped here were reaching out to her. In a panic, Maya finally managed to wrench herself away from the child's grasp, stumbling backward. The world around her felt dizzying, as though she was being pulled into a vortex, but she couldn't look away. There was something wrong with the child, something that was more than just a lost soul. It was as if the child itself was a part of the carousel, a piece of the broken machinery of the fairground, a twisted relic from a time long forgotten. One of us now, the child's voice repeated, over and over, the words becoming a maddening chant. Maya's vision swam as the carousel seemed to come alive. The horses, once frozen, were now galloping in a blur, their wooden bodies creaking and groaning with unnatural life. The faint music of the carousel had grown louder, more insistent, filling the air with its distorted, dissonant melody. The carnival had never been abandoned. It had never truly stopped. It was only waiting for someone like her to stumble into its grasp. The child's smile never faltered. With every step Maya took away from it, it followed, its movements like a shadow trailing behind her. The music grew louder still, until it felt like it was suffocating her, filling her lungs with its eerie refrain. She turned toward the other attractions, anything to break free from the child's grasp, from the suffocating presence of the carousel. But everything she saw was distorted, broken. The Ferris wheel towered above her, but its structure was warped, its seats twisted and bent in unnatural angles. The once beautiful, colorful tints were now faded, tattered, their once vibrant fabrics torn and shredded as if they had been abandoned for decades. The entire fairground felt like a dark mirror, a reflection of a place that had long ago decayed, consumed by something far more ancient and powerful than she could understand. The whispers of the lost children filled her ears again. Their voices were all around her, everywhere she turned. She tried to scream, to run, but her legs felt heavy, weighed down by the presence of the carousel, by the child, by the strange, unexplainable force that was pulling her in deeper. One of us now. The words had become a mantra, a suffocating chant that echoed in her skull. Maya's mind reeled as she tried to make sense of it all. She had to break free. She had to leave. But the fairground was changing around her, shifting, warping into something unrecognizable. And then, from the corner of her eye, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The Ferris wheel. It was moving, not in the way it should, not as a mechanical device would. No, it was spinning, its seats moving in eerie, jerky motions, as if they were being pulled by invisible strings. And then a figure appeared in one of the seats. A child. It was the same child. The child from the carousel. Come play. The child's voice echoed through the air, no longer a distant whisper, but a booming, insistent cry. Maya's heart clenched. She was trapped. The fairground wasn't just a haunted place. It was alive, and she had become part of it. One of them. Maya's heart pounded in her chest, each beat like a drum echoing through the suffocating silence of the decaying fairground. She stumbled backward, her legs weak, as her wide eyes darted between the shifting shadows. The carousel, the heart of it all, continued to spin, the soft, distorted music growing louder, more insistent. The child's laughter echoed in the background, twisted and unnatural, as if mocking her attempts to escape. She had tried. God, how she had tried to break free. She had run. She had screamed. But the fairground never released its grip. The more she fought, the more it pulled her in, like the jaws of an invisible trap closing around her. Maya turned toward the Ferris wheel again, its towering frame looming above her like some ancient sentinel. The child, perched in one of the seats, waved at her with a grin that stretched impossibly wide. The smile was the same, too wide, too perfect, and it was enough to make her stomach churn with nausea. The music was overwhelming now, a maddening, chaotic melody that seemed to come from all directions, filling her ears, her mind. The child's voice rang out once more, this time louder, clearer, like a command, "Come play." With us. Maya's blood ran cold, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Play? Was that what this was? Some kind of twisted game? She had thought, at first, that the fairground was just a haunted place, abandoned and forgotten. But this was something far worse. The fairground itself, the carousel, was alive. The music, the voices, the children. They were all part of it. They were the victims, trapped here in this endless cycle, bound to the fairground by some dark, malevolent force that had twisted their souls. She had come here seeking answers, hoping to uncover the truth about the long-abandoned carnival. But what she had discovered was far worse than anything she could have imagined. She wasn't just a visitor. She wasn't just a witness. She was part of it now, part of the broken, decaying machinery that had once brought joy, but now brought only suffering. One of us now. The words floated through her mind, like a chant, like a curse. Maya's eyes narrowed as she looked back at the carousel. There was something about the spinning horses, something wrong. Their eyes, once lifeless and cracked, were now wide open, gleaming with that same strange light that had consumed the child. Their mouths were open in silent screams, their wooden bodies jerking unnaturally, as though they were struggling to break free of their bonds. The whole carousel was shifting, warping, bending, as if it were alive, breathing, growing in some unnatural way. A loud crack echoed through the air as the Ferris wheel jerked violently. One of the seats snapped loose and fell to the ground with a deafening thud. The child, still grinning from ear to ear, was no longer in the seat. It was standing in front of Maya, its hollow eyes staring into hers with an intensity that made her want to scream. It was no longer just a child. It was something else, something that didn't belong in this world. Maya's legs finally gave way, and she collapsed to her knees, her hands trembling as they dug into the cracked earth beneath her. She couldn't escape. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The fairground had become a maze, shifting and twisting, pulling her deeper into its suffocating grasp. The carousel music rose to a deafening crescendo, a cacophony of haunting, discordant notes that seemed to echo in her very bones. One of us now. The words had lost their meaning. They were just a sound now, a constant hum in the back of her mind. Maya could feel herself slipping, her consciousness blurring at the edges as the world around her began to distort, folding in on itself like the twisted edges of an old photograph. She was losing herself. The child's voice called out to her again, but this time it was different. It wasn't a command anymore. It was a plea, a whisper of desperation, the kind that only the truly lost could understand. Please, come play. Maya's breath caught in her throat. The child wasn't asking her to play. It was begging to be free, begging for her to join the others, to fill the empty spaces, to become a part of the fairground's twisted cycle. And suddenly it clicked. Maya's mind, though foggy and distant, made the connection. The carousel wasn't just a ride. It was a prison for lost souls, for children who had once been full of life, full of joy, but had been taken, trapped. The broken fairground had consumed them, turning them into part of the machinery. It had done the same to her. It would do the same to everyone who stumbled in, everyone who sought to uncover its secrets. But there was one thing the fairground didn't have, one thing it couldn't take away: Maya's will. The realization hit her like a bolt of lightning. She wasn't like them. She wasn't trapped in this cycle. She could still fight. Maya rose to her feet, her breath ragged, her body shaking, but her resolve strengthening with every passing second. She wasn't going to play along. She wasn't going to become just another lost soul, another piece of the broken carousel. No, she was going to escape. She turned away from the child, from the carnival, from the carousel, and ran. The world seemed to spin around her, warping and shifting as if the very air itself was trying to drag her back. But she pushed on. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, but Maya drowned them out with the sound of her own heartbeat, the roar of her breath in her ears. And then, through the haze of the swirling madness, she saw it. The exit, the broken gate that had once been part of the entrance to the fairground. It was barely visible, half hidden behind the rusted, broken fences that surrounded the abandoned carnival. But it was there, a way out. With every ounce of strength, Maya ran toward it, her legs moving faster than they ever had before, driven by a sheer will to survive. She reached the gate, her hand grabbing the rusted metal bars, pulling them apart with a desperate force that felt almost supernatural. The gate creaked and groaned, but gave way, and in that moment, Maya broke free. The fairground, the carousel, the children, they all disappeared behind her, swallowed by the darkness, by the fog that seemed to rise up from the ground. Maya stood there, gasping for air, her body trembling with exhaustion and terror. But she was free. She had escaped. But as she turned to look back, the faintest trace of music, soft, haunting, almost imperceptible, floated to her ears. One of us now. It was only then, in that moment, that Maya realized the truth. The fairground had never let her go. It had only let her leave for now. But the music would always call her back, and there would always be another visitor.